chapter 8, James chapter 4, and we're actually going...
Pitch my title.
Probably. We're going to actually finish the chapter today.
Oh, wow. Do you know what I thought you said? Siggy.
Life is a vapour is what we're looking at today. And actually it's going to follow on very nicely from where we were over communion, looking at that verse, or those couple of verses from Ecclesiastes.
Of course it will. Life is a vapour
Yeah.
is the title of Ecclesiastes.
And we'll see what Mr. James has to say about this subject. Remember the rest of the chapter, where we've been previously in chapter 4, he's been looking in depth at the problem of worldliness. And actually I think what James is trying to do in this chapter, but really in the book as a whole, is to show us how to live in the light of that world that we looked at in Ecclesiastes that's all falling apart and you can't make any sense of. Well, actually there is a way in which we can make sense of it by just following what James has to say here, and he's highlighting some of the pitfalls that we could fall into and things like that. So what he's looking at, and again he's looking at the same sort of thing today, the subtle ways in which friendship with the world has infiltrated into the church. And he's identified that the root of the problem was to be found in the desires and the passions of the flesh. So it all comes from our flesh. And that leads to compromises in lifestyle and ultimately to enmity with God. And this letter, remember, it was originally written to Jewish believers who for one reason or another had found themselves living far away from Israel. And some of them had begun to be assimilated into the culture of the godless world that they found themselves in. And they've begun to adopt the practices and the way of thinking of the society in which they were living. So instead of adhering to the principles and the lifestyle of God's kingdom that they'd learnt through the apostles' teaching, they'd begun to backslide. Now, there are two kinds of people, and in this household there's one of each. Carol is a planner. And she likes to have everything planned out in detail so that she knows exactly what's going to happen. And I know she inherited that from her dad, because he was even worse. So Carol will know in pretty good detail what she's going to be doing every day. And this is particularly applicable when it comes to holidays. See, if it's a cruise, she'll spend hours researching each port with spreadsheets and options of things to do and things to see. She's most comfortable when life is planned out in one way or another. Whereas I'm much more laid back about it. I'm probably more of a hybrid in that I'll have a rough idea of what's coming up, but I like space and flexibility for spur of the moment decisions. Yeah. So, for instance, when it comes to the aforementioned holiday, all I need to know is when to pack my suitcase. See, I like an element of surprise and spontaneity. Yeah. In fact, we all make plans to some degree, even if it's just at the level of doing the weekly shop, planning ahead so that we have food in the house for the next few days. But what does the Bible have to say on this subject? You see, some Christians downplay the need for preparation and say that, we shouldn't need to plan ahead, but we should be led by the Spirit. Yeah. But I think that's a bit super spiritual. And I actually think that approach is unbiblical. Because it misinterprets what the Bible says about how we should prepare, and also what it means to depend on God. So James began this part of his letter by expanding on a practical, everyday problem, and then moving on to its larger contextual problem, that is, its application in life. You see, he's already identified that the source of conflicts is self-centeredness and a desire to appease the soul. Now he goes on to address another problem that presents itself in the way that we talk about our plans for the future. And he uses an illustration in order to enable us to see the root of this problem more clearly. So let's see what James has to say to us today. This is verses 13 to 17. Come now, you who say today or tomorrow we will go into such and such a town and spend a year there and trade and make a profit. Yet you do not know what tomorrow will bring. What is your life? For you're a mist that appears for a little time and then vanishes. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we will live and do this or that. As it is, you boast in your arrogance, and all such boasting is evil. So whoever knows the right thing to do and fails to do it, for him it is sin. Strong words yet again from James. Well, it seems that James is bringing a rebuke to his readers because they were making plans based on wrong assumptions and with wrong motivation. He's not rebuking them for the plans themselves, but for the way that they're going about it and talking about it. He says, come now. And it's actually a command for the reader to start to pay close attention. It carries a sense of urgency. We might put it into more sort of everyday language and say, listen up guys, this is important. It's very similar to the way that the Old Testament prophets confronted the people in order to gain their attention. And James narrates a typical conversation that he might have overheard, perhaps in the marketplace or the coffee shop or wherever people gathered to pass the time of day. Jewish merchants were common in the culture of James's day, so his readers would be very familiar with the illustration that he gives. You who say, well, that narrows it down to those people who say the kind of thing that he's about to give an example of. And this isn't just shooting the wind or wishful thinking. What he's talking about are well-reasoned and carefully put together plans. And he singles out 5 things. First, they plan to set out on a trip in a day or two. Tomorrow, or today or tomorrow, we will go to. Second, they plan to arrive at a destination. Today or tomorrow, we will go to such and such a town. Third, they plan to spend a certain amount of time there. Today or tomorrow, we will go to such and such a town and spend a year there. Fourth, they plan to engage in business and carry through a plan of action while they're in that town. Today or tomorrow, we will go to such and such a town, spend a year there, and engage in business. And then fifthly, they plan for the business to have certain results. Today or tomorrow, we will go to such and such a town, spend a year there, and engage in business and make a profit. So in their planning, they tackled the when, which is tomorrow, the who, that's we, the where, this or that town, how long, a year, the what, for business, and the why, to make a profit. So what's the problem here? Is it wrong to plan and intend to go places and do things? Well, no. Because in verse 15, James says it is legitimate to plan to do this or that. So what's wrong if it's not planning? Well, the answer lies not so much in what they're saying, but in what they're not saying. James rebukes these people because they're actually living with an attitude that neglected or disregarded God. They left God out of their plans altogether. Instead, they derived a sense of fulfillment and satisfaction from the feeling that they themselves were in control of their own destiny. It's actually a picture of self-made man taking credit for what God has given him. And the plan that was being made in verse 13 is made without taking a true view of life and God into account. Verse 14 explains the true view of life that's not being taken into account. And verse 15 explains the true view of God that's not being taken into account when they make their plans. So these people were actually living with a worldly attitude, making plans without taking into account their own mortality and God's sovereignty. You might remember that Jesus taught a parable that said something similar. In Luke 12, we read this. Jesus told them a parable saying, the land of a rich man, excuse me, the land of a rich man produced plentifully. And he thought to himself, what shall I do? For I have nowhere to store my crops. And he said, I'll do this. I will tear down my barns and build larger ones, and there I will store my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, be merry. But God said to him, fool, this night your soul is required of you. And the things that you have prepared, whose will they be? So is the one who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God. I think James may well have had that parable in his mind when he said these things. Do you remember the Beatles song Nowhere Man? Remember that? Its opening lines? He's a real nowhere man, living in his nowhere land, making all his nowhere plans for nobody.
Yeah.
Well, that's kind of what's going on here. They were making plans that could go nowhere because they'd left God out. Remember, James was addressing believers in these verses, and it highlights a problem that's common to many believers. They separate out spiritual life from normal everyday life. They make a distinction between the two. Well, actually, if you do that, it's a form of Gnosticism, which is a heresy that's been around since the very beginning of the church. And it's rooted in Greek philosophy that says that things that are spiritual are good and things that are physical are bad, making a distinction between the two. But in the Bible, there is no divide between things that are spiritual and things that are physical. We are one unified whole. We're body, soul and spirit, and there is no way of separating it. So we should view all of life as one entity, as Paul tells us in this verse in Colossians 3:23. Whatever you do, work heartily as for the Lord and not for men, knowing that from the Lord you will receive the inheritance as your reward. You are serving the Lord Christ. It means there's no distinction. Whatever we do it as unto the Lord. Because ultimately we're serving him, and he's the one that is going to reward us at the end of the age. So it makes no difference if you're in full flight in the prayer room or doing the washing up. Asher Trater put it this way. He said, it makes no difference if I'm taking a nap or raising the dead. The pay's the same. You see, you don't have a spiritual life and a non-spiritual life. You have a life.
Yeah.
So in this passage, James tells us 4 things. He says, life is a vapour. God is sovereign. Pride is a great sin. And the only sensible course is to be obedient to God's will. And you may remember, we've hinted at it a few times, that a couple of weeks ago Carol brought that message on Ecclesiastes and introduced us to the Hebrew word hevel, describing that elusive quality of something that's like a vapour or a cloud. It has substance, but it's very difficult to grasp. Well, that's exactly what James is describing here when he says that life is a vapour. It's unpredictable. You don't know how long it's going to last. It's here today and gone tomorrow. Now, if you're a pragmatist, you might be tempted to think, well, so what? What practical difference does it make if life is a vapour or if it's unpredictable? Does that mean I should stop planning just because my life may be short or it may be uncertain? And I think James would say, no, you don't stop planning, you don't just drop out, you don't become like a hermit waiting for your little vapour of life to disappear. The point is, for James and for God, it matters whether a true view of life informs and shapes the way you think and the way you speak about your plans. Your mindset and the way that you express it matters. How you talk about your plans matters. Now consider this. Believing that your life is a vapour may make no practical bottom line difference to what you plan to do. But in James's mind, and he speaks for God, it makes a difference how you think about it and how you talk about it. It matters because God created us not just to do things and go places with our bodies, but to have certain convictions and attitudes and verbal descriptions that reflect that truth. And that means a true view of life and of God. You see, God means for the truth about himself and about life to be known and felt and spoken of as a central part of our reason for being. So James says in verse 14, in all your planning, keep in your mind and give expression with your lips to this truth. You're a vapour that appears for a little while and then vanishes away. Keep in mind that you have no firm substance on this earth. You're fragile as a mist, like smoke. Keep in mind that you have no durability on this earth, for you appear for a little while, just a little while. Your time is relatively short. And keep in mind that you will disappear. You'll be gone. And your life will go on, and life in general will go on without you. It matters, he says, that you keep this view of life in mind and when you make your plans. Now, I appreciate that for those of us in this room, we're all nearer to the end of our lives than our beginning. We've all got a good number of years under our belts, and we just don't know how much time we have left. Yeah, that's a reality. So the frailty of life actually takes on perhaps a greater reality as our years advance. We may be fit and healthy today, but we don't know what will happen tomorrow. In fact, we don't even know what will happen 10 minutes from now, let alone tomorrow or next year. And what James is getting at here is that it's all too easy to make presumptive plans about an unknown future that we have no control over and no guarantees about. Those presumptive plans are caused by pride, which he's going to address shortly. Life is a vapour. Life is short. It may not seem like it after 70 odd years, but a vapour is short-lived, like the morning mist on a summer's day. You see it one moment and a few minutes later it's gone. That's what life is like. You probably know that many of the Psalms were written in David's generation. But there is actually one, Psalm 90, that was written by Moses many years before David. And in it, he reflects on the brevity of life. And speaking of our years on earth, he says in verses 5 and 6, you sweep them away as a flood. They're like a dream, like grass that's renewed in the morning. In the morning it flourishes and is renewed. In the evening it fades and withers. And then again in verse 10, the years of our life are 70, or even by reason of strength 80. Yet their span is but toil and trouble. They are soon gone, and we fly away.
Wow.
So according to Moses, many of us are now on borrowed time. And yeah. And he very wisely counsels us in verse 12 to number our days and not take them for granted so that we may gain a heart of wisdom. You see, only God can give us the wisdom that we need to spend our days profitably in the light of eternity. You've probably heard the famous quote by Benjamin Franklin, "In this world, nothing is certain but death and taxes."
Yeah.
And again, George Bernard Shaw once very astutely observed, the statistics on death are quite impressive. 1 out of 1 people die. The thing is, you think that because death is not just probable, but an absolute certainty, and that it could happen at any given minute, that people would be better prepared and maybe would want to know how to get right with God. But instead, people just put it out of mind and go on with life as if they will last forever. So the first thing that James wants us to get hold of is the brevity of life in the grand scheme of things. You're like a vapour. But alongside this, we also need to understand that it not only matters that you have a right view of life, but that you also have a right view of God when it comes to making your plans. So the second point that James makes in these verses is that God is sovereign. Now, there is a sense in which we are in control of our own destiny. God gives us the ability and the privilege of making choices that can impact on the direction and the course of our lives. That is part of the responsibility that we have in being able to exercise free will. However, that freedom of choice was designed to be employed under the guidance and direction of God. And it's when we begin to step outside of that guidance that we find ourselves in trouble. Because the Bible teaches us that ultimately the activities and the accomplishments of our lives are in God's hands. Quite simply, God governs what we accomplish. So not only are our lives in his hands, but also everything that we set our hearts to accomplish, they're also in his hands. See, God's sovereignty in our lives has to do with his will. That's why James says in verse 15, if the Lord wills. And if the Lord does not will, then whatever it is we set out to do will not be accomplished. We have to understand that when it comes to our plans, God's will is sometimes actually God's won't. If it's not his will for you, then it won't happen. That's why the Bible continually encourages us to become acquainted with the will of God for our lives, which is something that we should be consistently praying for. And Paul encourages us frequently to pray for the knowledge of God's will. For instance, Colossians 1:9. And so from the day that we heard, we've not ceased to pray for you, asking that you may be filled with the knowledge of his will in all spiritual wisdom and understanding. Again, Ephesians 5:17. Therefore do not be foolish, but understand what the will of the Lord is. Romans 12:2. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. You see, the problem that many Christians have with the will of God is that they view it incorrectly. Many people see the will of God as being like walking a tightrope, with danger on either side if you put a foot wrong. In other words, it's a very constricting thing that's intended to keep you on a very narrow way forward, where you have to concentrate very hard to avoid falling off. Now, I don't think that's a biblical view at all. And I think Gerald Coates summed it up with a much better illustration. He said the will of God is more like a broad grazing ground that has hedges at its boundaries. It's like the green pastures and the still waters of Psalm 23. There is freedom, but there are also boundaries. The boundaries are hedges. God hedges us in. And wisdom says, keep to the pastures. Don't try and push through the hedges, because you know what happens if you do? You end up looking like you've been dragged through the hedge backwards. So, back to our text. And incidentally, remember that verse in Psalm 119 that we looked at this morning, that last one of the section that we read through, that it was a broad thing. You see, the will of God is a broad thing. So back to our text. The issue that James is addressing was not that they were planning as though they themselves were sovereign and were not acknowledging the sovereignty of God. They were arrogantly making plans for their future financial security in this case, but those plans did not include God. They were thinking purely about themselves with no regard for the kingdom of God. So their trust was not in God, but their trust was actually in their ability to do business and all the money that they thought that they would make. They'd made the assumption that they were in control of their own future and that everything would go according to their plans. In all of our planning, we must realize that God is ultimately in control and his plans are the best. And as I'm sure you've all already discovered, there are times when his plan is not fully revealed until after the event. He will open doors and he will close doors. He'll change our hearts or change other people's hearts according to his purposes. And this can make planning difficult if we're not fully clear on what the will of God is. That's why it's often good to look back and reflect on recent events in your life and ask God the question, what were you wanting to achieve in my life? Did I miss anything? And one of the most basic lessons in life to learn is this: God is God and I am not God. Then in verse 15, James says we should say, if the Lord wills, as an acknowledgement that our plans are submitted to his will. Now in doing that, he's not giving us a trite formula for us to tack on to the end of every sentence, you know, a little bit like in Jesus' name, that tends to be the catch-all way that we end a prayer. It's interesting to read Paul's letters because sometimes he uses the phrase, if the Lord wills, when speaking about the future, and sometimes he doesn't. And I've given you some examples in your notes. But he also displays an attitude of dependence on the Lord and bowed before his sovereignty with regard to the future. And that comes out very clearly in the way that he writes his letters. So he doesn't always have to write, if the Lord wills, every other sentence sort of thing, you know. And what James is doing here is giving us a mindset that must permeate all of our life. We need to be constantly aware of our finiteness and our dependence on God and his sovereign purpose in every aspect of our lives. Now, as we read this passage, James is uncovering a deeper problem here than just the absence of some words or missing words and the presence of some bad theology. I think the heart of what he's getting at is actually found in verse 16. He says, as it is, you boast in your arrogance, and all such boasting is evil. See, the root problem in all of this is arrogance or pride. And the expression of that arrogance, he says, is boasting. In verse 13, there's a lot of saying what we will do, but there isn't any mention of God. So in verse 16, he chastises them and says, in your pride, you're all puffed up with arrogance. You're boasting in your plans for what you will do. Don't you know that all this boasting is evil in God's sight? And the Bible has a lot to say about pride, and none of it is good. It's one of the most subtle and far-reaching manifestations of sin that we encounter. And it's found to one degree or another in all of us. You see, pride finds an outlet in our lives in so many different ways. In this case, it was through arrogance that led to boastfulness. And put very simply, pride is the primary power within us that causes us to resist the will of God for our lives. Sometimes it will show in very obvious ways, like outright rejection of God's will because we think we know better. But often it's much more subtle than that, where we try to blend a little bit of obedience to God's will with some of our own will. So the way that pride was evident here was through their arrogant boasting, or perhaps more colloquially, they were bragging. It literally meant to be loud-mouthed about your own accomplishments. And the origin of the word that James uses actually refers to the idea of wandering about or aimlessly roaming. And it was used of people who got up on their soapbox in a public place in order to sell phony goods, purveyors of snake oil and miracle cures and so on. See, that's the idea James is wanting to get across. It was a brash bragging about their own cleverness and skill, and a denial of God's involvement in any of those achievements. James's condemnation of this arrogant boastfulness is actually very strong. He says all such boasting is evil. It's more than just making a mistake. It speaks of a determined, aggressive and fervent evil that actively opposes what is good. It's actually the same word that's used to describe Satan as the evil one elsewhere in the New Testament. So these are very strong words of condemnation by James, and we mustn't underestimate the impact that they're intended to make. It's a warning to us that if we exclude God from our thinking, from our hopes and dreams and desires for the future, looking instead to our own resources and abilities, we're actually aligning ourselves with the evil one. But before we move on, let me just say that not all boasting is wrong. You see, biblically there are some things that we can boast about because they're not rooted in pride. There is a proper boasting as described by God in the prophecy of Jeremiah, for instance, and this is the pattern that we should adopt for proper boasting, if we want to. Jeremiah 9 verses 23 and 24. Thus says the Lord, let not the wise man boast in his wisdom, let not the mighty man boast in his might, let not the rich man boast in his riches, but let him who boasts boast in this, that he understands and knows me, that I am the Lord who practices steadfast love, justice and righteousness in the earth. For in these things I delight, declares the Lord. Well, let's move on to the last thing that James tells us, which I summed up earlier by saying that humble obedience to God's will is the only sensible course to take. And this is really pretty much what James is saying in verse 17. Whoever knows the right thing to do and fails to do it, for him it is sin. Actually, this last verse seems to be a little bit disjointed from the context of what he's just been saying. You know, you could make the case for it being a general summary of all that he said up to this point. It is the last verse of the chapter, so you could say that he's sort of summing up the whole of the chapter in that one verse. And that would work, but actually he prefaces this last statement with a conjunction. So or therefore. And the presence of that conjunction in the grammar immediately connects it to what he's just said. So what James has in mind here is this. I've urged you to take the Lord into consideration in all of your life planning. Therefore, you now have no excuse in this matter. You know what you have to do, and if you fail to do so, it will count as sin. Now that puts today's passage in quite a serious context. What this does is to bring to our attention how easy it is to get so caught up in the business and the busyness of life that we forget to acknowledge our dependence on God and his sovereignty over our lives and everything that we do. And sin can be just as much about the things we don't do as about the things that we do. Now we tend to focus on sins where we've violated a direct command of God one way or another, but we also sin when we fail to do something positive that God has commanded us to do. And in the context of James's words to us today, the people he uses to illustrate his point were actually people who knew the will of God. They knew what they should do, But because of their pride and their arrogance, they chose to ignore it. See, this wasn't ignorance. This was clearly disobedience. So it begs the question, why do people who know the will of God deliberately disobey it? Well, there are many reasons why this happens. Pride, independence, fear of change, unbelief, fear of failure, rebellion, peer pressure, love of the world, anger towards God, misunderstanding God's goodness, seeing God as a hard taskmaster. The list goes on. But then there are some who act as though the will of God is something that they can either accept or reject. But the Bible is very clear. The will of God is not an option. We can't take it or leave it. Being in the centre of God's will for your life is the safest place to be. There's no better place. There might be easier places or more comfortable places, but none of them carry the same security and safety. And throughout the pages of the Bible, we read of men and women who lived through difficult times, survived seemingly impossible situations, left the familiar for the unfamiliar, endured life-threatening conditions. Some lost their lives for their mission and their faithfulness, but they honoured and they pleased God. They lived and rested in his promises because they were in the centre of God's will. When we're in the centre of God's will, we experience freedom from striving after earthly or worldly things, from the work of trying to please others, from the pressure to perform a certain way or to be the person that others think that we ought to be. We can wake up in the morning and face the day unfettered and with confidence. The very air looks, feels and smells different. We're free to be who we are, where we are. There's nothing greater than this kind of freedom. And with it comes joy, peace, and the ability to handle trouble of all kinds. And it's one of the reasons why we view everything in the context of the expectation of Jesus' return and the restoration of all things that he will accomplish. In our everyday lives, much of our thinking and our behaviour and the plans that we make are shaped by what we can see of our present circumstances, both in our immediate locality and in the world as a whole. It's what we were thinking about over communion. But the Bible speaks very frequently and forcefully of Jesus' return as the fact that should be directing how we live now. What Paul in his letter to Titus referred to as our blessed hope, the second coming and the future glory of Jesus, that should be the source of our greatest motivation when it comes to how we live our lives today. Are you living in the will of God? Here's a couple of scriptures that will help to point us in the right direction. 1 Timothy 2, 3 and 4. This is good and it's pleasing in the sight of God our Saviour, who desires all people to be saved and come to the knowledge of the truth. That's the first priority, that you should be saved and come to the knowledge of the truth. You can tick that box, okay? Yeah. You've been saved. But I think coming to the knowledge of the truth is something that we may still be working on. 1 Thessalonians 4 verse 3. For this is the will of God, your sanctification. Your sanctification, that's a lifelong process. Being made holy and living a life of purity. That's the will of God for you. Ephesians 5, 17 and 18. Therefore do not be foolish, but understand what the will of the Lord is. Do not get drunk with wine, for that's debauchery, but be filled with the Spirit. God has given you the gift of the Holy Spirit. And if you're going to be controlled by something, don't be under the control of worldly and useless things like alcohol, but be under the control of the Spirit. And then 1 Peter 2 verse 15. For this is the will of God, that by doing good you should put to silence the ignorance of foolish people. Your life speaks volumes even when you don't use words. Living a godly life means being submitted to the will of God and living it out, whatever the cost. And as you do so, it will have an impact on those around you. Now, of course, this isn't an exhaustive list at all. You know, there are many other verses that we could look at that illustrate what it means to be in the centre of the will of God. But imagine, perhaps in your younger days, you wanted to build a house. What would you do? Well, the first thing you would do is consult an architect and get him to draw up a plan. Now, the thing about architects is that they know what works and what doesn't, and what's the right way to go about building a house so that it doesn't fall down. So you get your plan from the architect and you set about building the house. But as you begin, you notice that some bits look maybe a little bit old-fashioned, a bit outdated compared to what other people are building. So you decide to change them for your own design to keep up appearances. And the more you look at the plan, the more you think, actually, this isn't really quite what I want. The size and the shape are okay, but I don't like the design. The layout's all wrong, and I'm sure it won't work for me. So you modify all the bits you don't like. And at the end of the day, the finished house looks nothing like the architect's original plans. And when the architect comes to inspect the house, there's no relationship between his design and what's been built. And the result is unstable, unsafe, and unreliable. God is the great architect. He's designed how life is to be built. And as true children of God, we should be committed to seeing God build our lives the way that He wants to build them. We might not always understand what He's doing or why He's doing it. But when you look at the alternatives and where they lead to, then the only sensible thing to do is to bow to His sovereignty, acknowledge that His ways are better, and yield to His perfect will. And in the words of the song that we sang earlier on, there's no place I'd rather be than here in your love. And I'm going to leave you with a verse from Romans chapter 12. I appeal to you therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. Amen.